Hey, everybody, and welcome back. Want to tell you thank you so much for joining me on this tabletop series that I've started. I really appreciate you following along, and hopefully, as we continue to grow, you see improvements with not only audio, but some of the effects that you'll see today. Nothing high tech, but as I grow and slowly improve, I would like to know that you're seeing a resemblance of that. With that said, please join me for the third and final of this tabletop series, and let's begin. In the first video, I looked at the incident from the perspective of a CISO. We talked about business impact, risk, leadership decisions, and business continuity. In the second video, I stepped into the role of an incident response lead. We looked at how I would approach the investigation, containment, evidence collection, eradication, and recovery. Today, we're going to take one more step back. The incident is over. The systems have been recovered. The immediate threat has been contained. Now I'm coming in as the security architect, and I'm going to be asking a very different question. What do we need to change so that the next attacker has a much harder time getting in, moving through the environment, and disrupting the business? So, just full disclosure, this is in no way me saying I would be better or would have handled the situation any different than they already did. This is in no way reflects on that outcome. This is just my perspective, taking a real world event and breaking it down as I see. With that said, let's look at what we learned in the first two videos. Let's start with the lessons from our previous two exercises. We learned from the first exercise the perspective of the CISO. We learned that a cybersecurity incident could quickly become a business continuity problem. The question wasn't simply, can we stop the ransomware? The question became, how do we protect the organization while continuing to safely operate? That is key. We all security agents need to remember. As our job is to keep the business safe, the business's job is to continue to pull in revenue and make sure they're operating. We need to balance that while we're continuing our best security practices. Now, from the IR perspective, we learned that we need to understand how the attacker got in. A lot more granular questions. What accounts were compromised? How they moved? What systems they accessed? What data may have been affected? And whether we can trust the environment again. Both different perspectives, both important. So, now as the architect, I want to take the lessons and turn them into security requirements. The first mistake I can make as a security architect is to immediately start naming products. Whether we have CrowdStrike or Splunk, firewalls or MFA, those things may all be useful, but what architecture should start with is asking the question, what tools do we already have? Following that is starting with, what are we trying to protect and what happens if this fails? These are both valid and important questions. What we're trying to gather is an understanding of what's already in the environment. What have we already invested in? What do we currently have before we add new things? What are the scope of these tools? And on laying on top of that, let's get an understanding of what we need to protect. Get a level of security that needs to be placed on these things. Is it information? Is it intellectual property? Is it PHI, PPI? We're in a pipeline, so we probably don't have that stuff, but we may have intellectual property. We may have customer data. May not even have information that needs to be saved. Maybe we just need to protect to make sure that the pipe is always open and the gauges are working clearly or correctly. Every scenario is going to be different, and that's why I feel we need to go in and understand that information before we start giving information. With that said, what the question again comes down to is, what are we protecting? For a pipeline operator, I would start by identifying the organization's most critical assets and processes. Things like operational technology, OT devices, control systems, pipeline monitoring, anything for the corporate IT, workstations, backup infrastructure, critical third-party connections. Now, I don't want to treat all these systems exactly the same. A receptionist laptop and a system involved in an operating critical infrastructure may both be computers. Does not mean they have the same risk. That is an important architectural concept. This should be one of the biggest sections in our video. As you can see here in the graph, we have a little diagram that we created. This is one of my first architecture priorities, would be understanding the separation of IT and OT. I don't want a compromised corporate workstation to have unrestricted access to systems responsible for operating critical infrastructure. A segmentation isn't simply putting a firewall between networks and solving a problem. So as you can see here, this is divided into going out to the internet, our control systems at the lower, OT networks, engineering systems, divided on to our business systems. We want to make sure that that's segmented, divided, so that we can, if one area is broken into, we can block off the other and keep things safe. Next, I look closely at identity. Who can access the environments? Who can get across? Who needs to get across? Do they need the same credentials? Who can, from where? Using what devices? Do they need to be outside the network to access these devices? What privilege do they need? And again, it all comes down to, do they actually need the access? Setting up controls like resistant MFA, least privilege, separate administrative accounts, just-in-time access where appropriate, strong authentication, conditional access, geo-blocking. All these would be valid questions that we need to ask to build a blueprint on when we start presenting the security options or tools that may need to. If an attacker steals one employee's credentials, I don't want those credentials to become a skeleton key to the environment. We need to make sure that we know how to block, who has access to what, and limit that access. Coming on the same line as access, remote access. We really need to make sure remote access is only allowed for what is absolutely business critical. Asking questions like, who has remote access? Does everybody? Should everybody? Why is that access needed? If they gain access, how are they getting access? Do they require MFA before they do? Is it just simply a password? Are privilege sessions monitored? Are we using tools like SecureLink? Are we monitoring these? Or can anybody just remote in? Are we allowing third parties to access our environment or vendors? And finally, can they access not only the business system side, but the OT side remotely? And what does that look like? Remote access should be treated as a high-risk pathway into the environment, especially when the pathway can eventually reach as something operational critical. The next layer is going to be endpoint security. So we kind of looked at the access. We're building a blueprint. Who has access? What roles and permissions? Why do they need that access? Can we segment the network and limit that? Now let's look at the endpoint side. Do we have or want an EDR? Application control, attack surface reduction, patch management, secure configurations, PowerShell monitoring, USB and device control. Are we allowing anybody to bring in their own devices or cell phones, and how do we control that? As an IR professional, I spend a lot of time looking at what attackers leave behind. As an architect, I want to take the lessons and ask, which of those attack paths can we eliminate before the attacker even gets in our environment? And if they do, how can we make it so difficult they can't move from the initial attack vector? Logging in the SIM. Again, when it comes down to remote access, we ask the question is, are there accounts or are those sessions recorded? How are we logging and knowing what's happening? If an attacker gets into the environment, how do we know they are? What are alerting structures? We want to centralize logging from authentication, privilege access, MFA, and directory services. Again, you have our endpoints we just talked about. Where are those logs for the EDR, the alerting, all that stuff? Firewalls and networks. All these logs need to go somewhere. Are we saving them? Are we backing them up? Are we alerting on them? And who is monitoring these? Where technically and operational is appropriate, security events, network telemetry, authentication. Again, these are all things that we need to be collecting, but at the same time having visibility. If we're collecting 50 terabytes of logs and nobody knows what we're looking at, we built an expensive storage system. We pretty much have become hoarders. We need to instead collect, normalize, detect, investigate, and respond. And actually, I really like this, so we're going to put that. Bear with me here. I didn't think about this, but I think this is important to remember. To collect, normalize, detect, investigate, and then respond. A lot for that, but I just wanted to share that with you. Next, again, that we're doing logging, and we understand logging backups. The next control system I would focus heavily on is backups and recovery. A backup isn't a backup simply because somebody tells me they exist. How can we restore it? How quickly? Have we done it? Is it isolated? If we get hit again, do we have a worry that that backup can be corrupted? Who can delete it? Who can reach it? And who has those permissions? And finally, one of the most important, I believe, is have we tested, and do we periodically test? I'd want a combination of protected and isolated backups clearly defined, recovery objectives, and regularly restore testing. This is where the first video comes back, and this is what brings us back to our CISO tabletop. Remember the question we had. Do we shut it down? As an architect, I want to make sure we're not asking that question for the first time during attack. We should already know what systems are critical, how long can they be unavailable, what manual processes exist, what are our downtime procedures, what dependencies they have, what the recovery sequence is, and who has authority to make those decisions. That is where BCP and DR become architecture requirements, not just documents. We should be doing not only these tabletops on a real-time, yearly, if not other, but we should be doing a back business continuity plan. And DRs become, again, very important. Now it brings us to the threat hunting experience. Architecture does not stop at prevention. That is great. We've set up our roadblocks. We believe we're secure, but there is no such thing as a 100% risk-free environment. Always assume something will get through. What would I want our SOC or our SOC to detect? Unusual authentication, privileged account abuse, lateral movement, remote service execution, business suspicious PowerShells, unusual DNS activity. As we've gone through this, I hope you guys have seen that we started kind of at the top, started asking questions, and methodically moved down the line. We want to make sure that we are protecting the front barrier, but at the same time, coming back around and responding and acting on those. And this is where I want the architecture, detection, engineering, and incident response teams working together. Now, anybody that's worked in security understands third-party risk. We need to understand who connects to our environment. What do they have access to? How is that access authenticated? Can we turn it off quickly? Do we monitor it? What happens if that vendor gets compromised? These are critical questions that need to be asked, if not quarterly, annually, going through each of our vendors and asking that, and maybe even testing sometimes. Third-party risk is a huge issue, and that boundary sometimes doesn't necessarily end at the firewall. Sometimes it ends with vendor security ends. We need to remember that we need to pull everything together. We need to prevent, identify, protect, detect, contain, respond, recover, and learn. Never forget that learning part. This is never going to work out, just like these videos, 100% every time. I don't want one control protecting this organization. I want layers. The same token, we need to make sure that those layers are not just pieces of paper we're throwing at to say we have them. Have we built these layers up? Do we know what they do? Are we overlapping on the right points and not overlapping on the not? Remember, as a security, we are cost. We need to make sure that organization can make money and secure it without hindering that. Questions that we'd ask. If MFA fails, will the endpoint security help? If EDR misses something, does network monitoring help? If segmentation fails, can identity controls help? These are questions that get down all the way to, if containment fails, do we have backups? This is defense in depth. Each layer helps protect and give a little boost to the other one. So, how would I prioritize the work? I mean, as much as I wish, we would have to set up a plan. We would go maybe a 90-day plan of 360. So let's look at a 360 a year plan. We need to those first 90 days get those questions answered. Understand again our asset inventory, our segmentation, our network, our identities, remote access, critical systems. Those first few questions that we asked at the beginning of the video, those are what need to have answers. Once we get those answers, we can then start reducing the risk. We can strengthen our MFA if needed, reduce privileged access, improve segmentation, improve EDR coverage, close major logging gaps, and response. We need to now start strengthening our borders. We now know the borders. We understand what we're protecting. Now we need to get those tools, the right tools, or improve our use of the tools we have in the right places under the right hands. The following 6 months after we have this is our maturing stage. Tuning our detections, making sure we're testing and automating those responses. Test and control validations. Make sure we're monitoring and test those logs. Again, come back with a tabletop exercise. Do this again. How would we respond differently now that we have those tools? Do third-party risk assessment and access reviews. And as always, architecture governance. I would measure whether those changes actually reduce the risk. And have we matured in that 6 to 12 month time frame where we can then go back and start again, re-ask those questions, get different answers, and continue to grow. How do we know it worked? Honestly, you don't until you've been owned. But with that said, when we do these tabletop, you will see a difference in growth. How are we responding? How is our staff responding? You know, we don't want to just say we implement FA. It will reduce risk. We need to go say we not only implemented MFA, but we have validated that everybody knows how to use it. We've secured, and its privileges are given to the right people. These are layers. Again, a percentage of privilege accounts using phishing-resistant MFA. Are we, instead of just through SMS, we're using Authenticator, a token key. Again, everything goes in levels of the security level. A percentage of critical systems covered by EDR. Did that metric improve? Is our EDR catching? Are we getting alert overload? These are questions that need to be asked at the end. These will show us have we improved or not. Our mean time to detect, has that improved? Mean time to contain. Run these tabletops, red teams, even just low-level red teams where we test that stuff. Those are things that an architect can implement and work with the leads of the IR, the CISO, and get worked through. Have we limited the necessary the unnecessary IT to OT pathways? Have we made sure segmentation is cleaned? Have we made sure that those permissions have been protected? At the end of the day, we don't know until we see it in action, and that was our job to make sure that we're doing these tabletops and putting into action. It's not just words. So, we've done all this stuff. We've worked with a CISO. We've worked as a IR lead and as an architect. And we all get in front of a CEO and they ask, are we safer? Tough question to answer. But with everything we've done, I would say yes. But I wouldn't define that simply by the number of security controls we've implemented. We have identified our critical systems dependencies. We've reduced unnecessary access between environments. We've strengthened identity and privileged access. We've improved our ability to detect and contain attacks. We've increased the resilience of our backups and recovery process, and we've tested our response capabilities. There is no environment that we can promise that we will never be breached. What we can tell you is that we reduced the likelihood of a successful attack, reduced the potential blast radius, and improved our ability to detect an attacker, and improve our ability to recover if prevention fails. Wow, that's the conversation I want to be able to have as a security architect. That was big. We have done so much as a security architect, and that was such a growth from where we started as CISO and a different look. So, let's wrap up this 3-part Colonial Pipeline series. Remember, we started as the CISO. We moved into incident response. And finally, we looked at the problem through the eyes of a security architect. And honestly, that journey is I'm working on myself. I've spent years developing my technical skills. And I love it. I love incident response. I love getting into the weeds and figuring out what happened. But I am trying to change myself and go beyond that. I want to understand the business. I want to understand risk. I want to understand architecture. And I want to be able to sit in a room with executives and explain not only what happened, but what we should do about it and why. And again, that's what this channel is going on about. I'm going to keep working through CTFs, incident response, tabletop architecture, and real-world incidents. As you've seen, I'm making mistakes, but I'm hoping to continue to prove and to learn. Hopefully you continue to follow along and we get better together. If you watch all 3 videos, thank you. I'd love to hear from you. And if you were a security architect, what would you have done differently? Thank you again for watching. I'll see you on the next one.